Life for city folk was in stark contrast. The poverty born of unemployment was rampant as factories ran out of imported raw materials and laid off the workers. And while family budgets shrank from wage size down to welfare size, the price of available food went up. Attempts at price control were just not as diligent as in Britain. In the Dole, there were protests at the near-starving conditions in the slums. While those with money could sometimes overcome shortages on the thriving black market, finding food or even tobacco, these people had no such option. If they were lucky enough to have a job at all, their wages had been frozen by the government, a bitter blow. But it was said the people would suffer anything rather than have bombs raining down on them. The shortages were now biting deeper. While there was beef and bacon, you now had to produce your ration card to your shopkeeper for your meager allocation of tea or sugar. Bread was now rationed too, in short supply and much maligned. Wheat imports had virtually ended, so now bread was made of Irish whole wheat, brown bread full of roughage and nutrition, but with a sour taste and anathema to the Irish palate, which longed for a return of fine white bread. Tea was carefully measured out at the rate of ½ an ounce per person, so the leaves were used, carefully dried, used again and again until exhausted. And to fill out their allocation, they added dried blackberry leaves, ash and hawthorn leaves. And such food as people could find was difficult to cook. Our gas was then manufactured from imported coal. Imports had dwindled, so homes got just 16% of the gas they normally used. And by the rules, the gas cooker could only be turned on for a few hours a day. But of course, there was always gas in the pipe network, and if you turned it on outside those permitted hours, there was just enough to produce a glimmer of light, enough to boil a kettle. And that temptation saw the emergence of another bogeyman of the war years, the glimmer man, who might swoop on your house and hold his hand over the gas jet to see if it was hot, if you'd been cheating, in which case he'd cut off your supply altogether. Coal fueled our electricity generating stations too, so electricity production was reduced, which made the once skeptically viewed hydroelectric scheme at Shannon all the more valuable nationally. Traditionally, the towns and cities had warmed themselves with coal. But now, by 1941, there was absolutely no coal available for domestic use. The choice was to go cold or change the habit of a lifetime and burn the turf which was for so long associated with countryside and cottage. In areas like the Phoenix Park in Dublin, massive depots of turf were built up. Teams of civil servants volunteered to move onto the bogs to help harvest the wet brown sods, and even the army was put to work with soldiers complaining that they didn't join up to cut turf. A common sight on the streets was of man, woman or child pushing a pram filled with turf bought at the local depot and given free to those on social welfare. Children were sometimes kept home from school so they could queue up all day for their turf allocation. The general complaint was that the turf was too wet to burn. One explanation might have been these train wagons, which brought much of the turf from the western and midland areas to the cities. There were no proper goods wagons to be had, and these were nothing more than run-down third-class passenger coaches of another time, with the roofs torn off. Open to the weather, the turf of course got wet. That was one explanation. The other, put forward by harassed householders, was that because it was sold by weight, and the wetter it was, the more profitable it became, it achieved remarkable weight and value while in the hands of the merchants. In an improbable enterprise, the young unemployed of the cities were formed into labor camps, which had a double purpose. They occupied the otherwise idle young men who were feared as a source of economic and social disintegration, and they produced some turf. But the back-straining work and isolation didn't suit many who pined for their crowded tenements. The construction corps was a similar project, with unemployed men building the Baldonnel and Gormanstown airstrips under army direction. But the Corps found little favour either with the unemployed or with the army, and it fizzled out. The growing mass of the unemployed favoured the traditional solution to their plight: emigration. With the war economy booming in Britain, our unemployed left in droves, taking the blacked-out mailboat to find well-paid jobs, and Britain was eager to take them, to work in the armaments factories, construct their airfields, to operate the railways, mostly to work the building sites. And they became our first illegals abroad. After 2 years in Britain, they risked being drafted into the army, so they moved on to another city. Thus, McAlpine's Fusiliers were born, with recruiting offices, so to speak, set up by the McAlpine Construction Company in western towns like Ballina. But before getting the necessary work permit, there was what many found a degrading ritual to be undergone. And so many family men quietly shuffled naked through delousing centres, and only when certified free of lice were they allowed to join the British workforce. For Dubliners, that meant turning up at Tara Street baths to be deloused. The bitter sense of humiliation is still burned into many a mind, but it was a price they paid for a job and good wages. And sharing the blacked-out mailboat, the men who joined the British Army as their means of escaping unemployment, to fight the fascist alongside the other Irishmen who joined up out of family tradition or individual decision. But emigration was not open to every would-be worker. The government began to realize that the emigrant ship was not only solving the unemployment problem, it was also taking away the skills we needed in rural Ireland to feed ourselves. So they refused to give emigration permits to the men of rural Ireland who were needed to work the land and save the turf. As we tried to ensure a fair share out of what we had, clothes too became rationed and became tradable, with people bartering shoes and nylon stockings or clothes ration coupons for food. And there was a knock-on effect for the poor. The clothes of the better off would have gone to the second-hand clothes market, bought for a few shillings. But now even those with money had to hold on to their clothes for longer because supplies had diminished, so there was even less for the poor. It didn't rain equally on the just and the unjust. Transport practically ground to a halt for lack of petrol for cars and trucks, for lack of coal for trains, and lack of electricity for trams. The railways struggled on using turf, but it had only a fraction of the energy of coal, and trains would arrive hours late, often stopping on the line to start up the fire again, or gather wood from the side of the line. Boilers blew up, trains were abandoned on the rail. Most railway companies tottered on the edge of bankruptcy for lack of traffic and income, and they were all drawn together to form CIE. And the alternatives made a comeback. Bicycles were the order of the day, with the government fixing their price at £8. Puncture repair kits and spare parts were eagerly sought after, and those who had elevated themselves to the ownership of a motor car now returned to the horse and trap to do their business.